There is a word in my mother's tongue for a thing that was beautiful once and is not anymore. We use it for cracked glaze on old vessels, for a bloom gone brown at the edges, for a hull hold below the waterline. The word is Veshtir. On the morning they presented me to the marriage council, the Speaker of Houses used that word, and he used it about me, and he did not lower his voice when he said it. I had been awake since the dark before the dark. The dressers had bathed me in oils that were meant to lift the skin to a pale, even shine, and when the oils failed, as they always failed, they had powdered me, and when the powder caught in the modeling along my shoulders and made it worse, they had given up and dressed me in the high collar and the long gloves and the veil of pearl thread, which is what the Ilthari put on a daughter when they have stopped pretending. I remember the cold of the antechamber. I remember the sound of the council beyond the great doors, the low water music of 200 voices that go quiet when a thing they have already decided is brought before them so they can decide it again, out loud, for the record. My mother did not come to the antechamber. High Matriarch Oren did not believe in farewells, because a farewell admits that something is being lost, and she did not consider me a loss. She considered me a correction. She had sent instead her steward, a thin gray man named Severin, who held a writing board and would not meet my eyes, and who said when the dressers had finished, "Hold your chin level, princess. It is the only kindness the room will allow you, and you should take it." So I held my chin level, and the doors opened, and I walked the length of the council hall under the pale daylight that fell through the high windows, and I let them look at me. You must understand what beauty is to my people, or none of what came after will make sense. The Ilthari are a people of skin. We read each other the way you might read a face, but for us the whole body is the face. The smoothness of it, the evenness, the way light lies along an unbroken surface like still water lies in a basin. A child born with skin like clear water is born already halfway to a throne. A child born with the dark veining we call the stain, the spreading bronze and shadow modeling that comes up out of nothing in the years of growing and cannot be bleached or burned or prayed away, that child is born Veshtir, beautiful once in the possibility of it and then not. The marriage council exists to keep the lines clean. The pale houses do not wed the stained. That is not cruelty to them. It is hygiene. It is the maintenance of a thing they love. I had been a clear water child. That is the part they could not forgive. For 11 years I had been the brightest of the high matriarch's daughters, the one the tutors praised, the one the visiting houses asked after, the one whose hand a dozen heirs had hoped to take. And then in my 12th year the first dark line came up along the inside of my wrist like a root pushing through soil, and by my 14th it had crossed my shoulders and climbed my throat, and the tutors stopped praising me, and the heirs stopped asking, and my mother began to look at me, the way one looks at a wall where a beloved painting used to hang. The speaker read the formula. I will not pretend I did not know it was coming. He read that the House of Oren presented the daughter Vera to the council for consideration, and that the council, having considered, found her unfit for the keeping of any line, her surface being marred beyond the tolerance of the pale compact, and that she was therefore struck from the rolls of the marriageable and remanded to the care of the quiet houses, there to live out her days apart, that the lines might stay clear. He used the word Veshtir at the end, the way you set a stone on a stack to keep the wind from taking the papers. There is a thing they do after, which is the part I have never told anyone, not even Hale, until long after. They shear you. It is meant to be a mercy, the same as Severin's chin. A stained woman who keeps her hair long is said to be reaching above her station, pretending at a beauty she has been judged not to own, and so she is mocked for it. And to spare her the mocking they take it from her in the hall, before the council with a blade, while everyone watches and no one speaks. My hair had been black and very long, and the one thing left on me that the powder could not ruin. A councilwoman came down from the tiers with a curved knife, and gathered it in her fist, and cut it close to the scalp in 4 strokes, and let it fall to the marble, and I stood with my chin level the whole time because Severin had told me it was the only kindness the room would allow. I did not cry. I want that written plainly because it matters to what comes after. The eyes of my people are made to weep easily. It is one of the soft beauties they prize, the bright wet eye, the trembling lash. I had learned by then that to weep was to give them the picture they wanted, the ruined girl ruined further, and so I had taught myself the hard thing, which is to let the water rise to the lid of the eye and hold it there and not let it fall. My eyes are the color of old copper, dark and warm, and they were wet in that hall, but the tears did not fall, and I have always thought that was the first small war I won, though no one in that room knew a war had been fought. They put me in a closed carriage and sent me up the mountain to Greyhold, and that is where this story truly starts, because that is where the human was. Greyhold sits at the top of the Caervale Road, in the country above the tree line where the wind comes off the ice fields and the daylight is thin and white and the gardens grow nothing but frost flowers and hardy gray moss. It is the oldest of the quiet houses, the place the pale houses send the daughters and the sons they cannot stand to look at, the marked, the malformed, the ones whose surface offends. It is not a prison. They are very particular about that. The doors are not locked. You may walk out of Greyhold any hour you like. There is simply nowhere to walk to, and no one below who will take you in, and the cold will have you before the second night. And so the unlocked door is the cruelest thing in the house, because it makes your staying a choice you are seen to have made. I arrived in the last gray hour of the day. The steward who took me in was an old man named Brannock, broad and stooped, his own face marked with the wide pale blotches that are the other kind of stain, the kind you are born with rather than the kind that comes for you. He had a way of looking at a new arrival that I did not understand for a long time. It was not pity. Pity I knew. This was something steadier and harder, like a man looking at the weather and deciding what it would do. He took my one bag and said, "You'll want the east room, it gets the morning. Supper's at the second bell. The human eats with us. You'll find that strange the first night and ordinary by the third." "The what?" I said. It was the first thing I had said since the council hall. "The human," said Brannock, as if that were an answer, and carried my bag up the stairs. I had heard of humans, the way one hears of a far country's weather. They had come into the reach of the Ilthari worlds only a handful of years before, traders and surveyors, and lately the relief crews. The medical exchange, which was a young and fragile thing built on the fact that humans, it turned out, were very good at the unglamorous work of keeping bodies alive. And the Ilthari, for all our love of the surface, had let the deep medicine of the body fall into neglect, especially in the high country, especially among the unfit, whom no good physician would waste a career on. So a human had been posted to Greyhold, the first one ever to come so high. I thought of it the way you think of a rumor. I did not think it would matter to me. I had stopped that day, believing that anything would matter to me again. I met him at the second bell. The eating hall at Greyhold is a long, low room with a long, low table, and the residents come down to it in their own time, the marked and the malformed, and the ones the pale houses had thrown up the mountain over 40 years, and they take their places without ceremony, because ceremony is a thing for the surface, and we were all past the surface now. There were perhaps 30 of us. There was an old woman named Sarah whose whole left side was the bronze-dark mottling, worse than mine, who had been at Greyhold longer than Brannock, and who ran the kitchens with an iron and tender hand. There were 2 brothers, twins, born with the bone-soft faces the doctors below could have set straight in infancy, and had chosen not to because the family had not wished to pay for a child it intended to discard. There was a man my own age, Toller, blind from a fever the lowland physicians had not bothered to treat. We were the leftover people, the Veshtir, and at the head of the table in the chair the steward gives an honored guest sat the human. I had imagined, I think, something more frightening. Humans were spoken of below as a coarse and unfinished species, thick-skinned, blunt-featured, their surfaces a riot of texture and color and damage, no 2 of them alike, none of them clean, and he was all of that by the measure of my people. His skin was a weathered brown, lined deep at the eyes, and there was gray coming in hard at his temples and through the short, rough beard, and along the back of his hands ran a webbing of old scars, pale on the brown, that I would learn later came from a decade of field surgery in places where the gloves ran out before the wounded did. He was not young. He was not beautiful. By everything I had been raised to read, his body was a record of every wrong thing that can happen to a body, written on him and unhidden. And here is the thing I felt, standing in the doorway in my high collar and my pearl thread veil, with my shorn scalp under it, and the modeling I knew everyone in the room could see at my wrists where the gloves ended. I felt, looking at him, the strangest small flicker of something I had no word for. Because his body was marked everywhere, scarred and weathered and unsmooth, and he carried it like a man who had simply never been told it was a thing to carry. He sat at the head of the table with his sleeves pushed up over those ruined hands as if scars were the most ordinary furniture in the world. And I thought, he does not know. He does not know that he is Veshtir. No one ever taught him. He saw me in the doorway. The whole table had gone quiet, the way a table goes quiet for a new arrival, the soft assessment, and I braced for it, the flick of the eyes to the wrists and the throat, the small adjustment of the face. The Ilthari are too well-bred to stare. They glance and they file you and they look away, and you spend the rest of your life among the people who have filed you. I knew that glance the way you know the sound of your own name. He did not do it. He looked at me the way you look at a person. At all of me, the face and the eyes and the held chin, and then he stood. Humans stand for an arriving stranger, I would learn. It is a thing their bodies do without being asked, and he said in the careful, slightly wrong-footed Ilthari of someone who has worked hard to learn it, "You'll be the one from the carriage." Brannock said, "There's a seat by the fire. The food's better than the room makes you expect." That was all. He did not glance at my wrists. I want to be exact about this, because at the time I did not believe it and spent the whole meal waiting for the glance, the way you wait for the second boot to drop. It did not come. He looked at my face when I spoke and at the table when I did not, the way a person looks who is simply sharing a room with you, and not once in that entire first night did his eyes go to the parts of me that every other person in my life had gone to first. I took the seat by the fire. I did not lift the veil. I ate very little. I watched him. His name was Tomas Hale. He was, he said when Sarah asked, 41 years old by the count of his own world, which made him old for the work he did, and he had come up to Greyhold because the relief office had asked for someone to take the high posting and no one else had wanted it. The high country being cold and far and full of patients no one below cared whether they treated. He said this plainly, without bitterness and without nobility, the way a man states the weather. He had a low voice and he used few words, and when he did not have anything to say, he was content to say nothing, which is a rarer thing than people think, and which the Ilthari, who fill every silence with assessment, do very poorly. When the meal was done, he went round the table, not making a show of it, and asked after this one's cough and that one's joints, and he crouched by old Toller and put 2 fingers very lightly on the blind man's eyelids, and talked to him low for a while about whether the light still hurt. And I understood that this was a man doing his work, but I understood also that he touched them. He put his scarred human hands on the marked skin of the unfit without gloves and without flinching, and without the held breath that the lowland physicians wore like a second coat. He touched Sarah's bronze-dark arm to feel the heat of a swollen joint as easily as if it were any arm, because to him, I would come to understand, it was any arm. He had not been raised to read skin. He had been raised, somewhere far away, to read the body underneath it. I went up to the east room that night and stood at the cold window and put my fingers to the dark veining at my throat in the dark, where no one could see me do it, and I tried to remember the last time someone had looked at my face before they looked at my skin. I could not remember. I thought perhaps no one ever had. The first true conversation we had was 3 days later, and it was an argument, which I have always been glad of, because it meant that the first thing he learned about me was that I had a mind and would use it on him. There is a plant that grows in the frost gardens at Greyhold, a hardy gray moss the Ilthari call winterbread, and Sarah's kitchen lived on it through the cold months, and that winter it had come up wrong, soft and dark at the root, a rot. Hale had been studying it. He had set up a corner of the old library with his instruments, a small, bright, fierce island of human equipment in that gray stone house, and he was bent over a sample under a lens when I came in to return a book, and he looked up and said, without preamble, "You're educated. Brannock said you had tutors below. Come look at this and tell me what it is." I had not been asked to look at anything and tell anyone what it was since the day the first dark line came up on my wrist. The Ilthari do not consult the Veshtir. We are the looked at, not the looking. I stood in the doorway, and I think some old reflex of contempt rose in me, the contempt the wounded keep ready, and I said, "I am struck from the roles of the marriageable and remanded to the care of the quiet houses. I am not a botanist." He looked at me for a moment. Then he said, "I didn't ask the roles. I asked you," and he turned back to the lens as if the matter were settled, leaving the stool beside him empty. I will not pretend I sat down at once. I went away and was angry for an afternoon, the way you are angry at a thing that has shifted the ground under a settled grief. But the moss was dying, and Sarah's kitchen depended on it, and the unfitted greyhold ate thin enough as it was. And in the end I went back, and I sat on the stool, and I looked through the lens, and I knew the rot, because the rot was an old country trouble, and one of my tutors below had been a dull man who loved soils. And I told Hale it was the blackroot, that it came when the meltwater sat too long against the bed, that you broke it by lifting the beds onto stone and letting the water run off. That my grandmother's keepers had done it in the high gardens 100 years ago and written it down. He listened to the whole of it without once interrupting, which no one below would have done to a stained woman, and when I had finished he said, "Then that's what we'll do," and he meant it as we. And the next morning he and Brannock and I were out in the freezing garden lifting the moss beds onto stone with our hands, and my gloves got wet and I had to take them off. And there, in the white daylight, my wrists were bare, the mottling stark against the snow, and he looked. Because you cannot work beside a person and never look, but he looked at my hands working, not at the skin of them, and he said, "You've done garden work before," which was not true, and I said so, and he said, "You've got the hands for it anyway," and went back to lifting stone. It is a small thing. I know it is a small thing. But I had spent 4 years learning that my hands were a thing to keep gloved and hidden because they were marked, and a human looked at them bare in the snow and saw that they were good at lifting stone, and said so. And the saying of it undid something in me that the shearing knife had not been able to touch. That was the shape of that winter. I do not know how to make it a story with a single turning, because it was not one. It was 100 small things, the slow lifting of beds onto stone. He never made a project of me. That is the part I have tried hardest over the years to make people understand, because they always wanted to have been a grand kindness, a man who saw the broken princess and set out to mend her. It was not that. It was smaller and far harder than that. He simply went on day after day, in the plain, unconsidered way of a man who had genuinely never learned that my skin meant anything, treating me as if I were a person whose company was worth keeping and whose mind was worth using. And he did it so steadily, and for so long, that I stopped waiting for the glance, the second boot, the day he would finally see what everyone saw. The day did not come. It is a strange and terrible thing to brace for a blow for years, and then slowly understand that the hand was never raised. We worked. I read his books, the human ones he had brought in the careful translations he made for me at night, and I argued with them, and he liked it when I argued. He taught me to set a bone and to read a fever and to clean a wound without flinching, and I found I had hands for that too, steady hands, and he came to lean on me in the small surgery the way you lean on a colleague, sending me to old Toller with the eye salve, and to the soft-faced twins with the joint traps, and the residents grew used to the marked princess coming with the human's medicine, and some of them, I think, forgot to think of me as the marked princess at all, which is a thing I had not known I was starving for until I had a little of it. I will tell you the night I understood it was more than a colleague's leaning, because I think you will want to know, and because it was, like everything with him, a small thing and not a grand one. There was a storm at the turn of deep winter, the kind that comes off the ice fields and sits on the house for 3 days, and on the second night one of the soft-faced twins, the younger, took a fever that climbed and climbed, and Hale and I sat up with him in the cold surgery through the dark, bringing the fever down by hand, with cloths and cold and the human medicines, and somewhere in the worst hour of it, when we did not know if the boy would see the morning. Hale was very quiet and very steady at the boy's side, and I was across the cot from him with my hand on the boy's chest counting the breaths, and the lamp was low, and I had not worn the veil in the surgery for weeks because you cannot nurse a fever through a veil, and I looked up and found that Hale was looking at me. Not at the skin. I had stopped by then even checking. He was looking at my face in the low light, and there was a thing in his weathered human face that I had no name for in my own tongue, because my tongue has 100 words for the surface of a person and almost none for the inside, and the thing in his face was about the inside. He looked away when the boy stirred, and we went back to the work, and the boy lived, and we never spoke of it. But I had seen it. And I lay awake after in the east room with the storm on the roof, and I did the hardest sum of my life, which was to let myself believe what I had seen, because to believe it was to set down the whole armor of my contempt, the contempt that had kept me upright since the council hall, and I was afraid that without the armor I would simply come apart. The Veshtir learned to live in armor. We forget there was ever a body under it that wanted, very badly, to be touched and not to flinch. The court came in the thaw. I should have known it would. The Ilthari do not strike a daughter from the rolls and then forget her. There is a second rite, a slower one, called the severance, in which the house comes up to the quiet house where the unfit one has been sent and formally ends her, not in body but in line and name, removes her from the rolls of the living house and enters her in the rolls of the dead, so that the surface of the family may close clean and unbroken over the place where she was. It is the kindest thing they believe they can do. After the severance the family may mourn you properly, as a thing lost, rather than carry you on as a thing that went wrong. My mother had waited the decent interval, a single turning of the seasons, and then she came up the mountain to bury me while I still breathed. She came with the full delegation, Severin the Grey Steward, and the Speaker of Houses with his board of formulas, and 4 council women in pearl, and a physician of the Pale Compact whose task it was to certify the marring beyond repair, so that the record would be complete. They came in the bright thaw morning, 3 closed carriages on the Caervale road, and Brannock met them at the door, and the whole of Greyhold went quiet and small, the way the unfit go quiet when the pale houses come among us, because the sight of us together, the marked and the malformed in one room, is a thing they find very hard to bear, and we have learned to make ourselves less, to spare them, which is its own kind of obscenity when you think on it. They put me in the high collar, and the gloves, and the pearl thread veil again. Sarah dressed me, her bronze-dark hands very gentle, and she did not say anything comforting because there was nothing comforting to say. But at the end she pressed her marked palm flat against my marked cheek for a moment, skin to skin, the way we do among ourselves where no one is watching, the touch the pale houses would call obscene, and it was the truest thing anyone had done for me in a year, and I held my chin level so the water in my eyes would not fall. The severance is held in the great hall of the quiet house, and Greyhold's great hall is a cold gray room with 1 tall window and a long bare floor, and they arranged it like a small council, the delegation on chairs along one side and a single chair for me in the center where the light fell, and the residents of Greyhold were permitted to stand at the back because the rite requires witnesses, though we were not the kind of witnesses anyone would later consult. Hale stood at the back among them. I had told him what the severance was on the night the carriages were sighted on the road, and he had listened in the way he listened, without interrupting, and at the end he had asked only one question, which was, "And after they've done it, what happens to you?" And I had said, "Nothing happens to me. I stay here." I am only made dead in the rolls below, that is all. And he had been quiet for a long time, and then he had said a thing I did not understand at the time, which was, "Not in mine," and gone to his books. My mother did not look at me when she came in. She had not looked at me since the year the line came up my throat. She took her chair, and the speaker read the long formula of the severance, which recites the whole history of the marring, the year of the first line and the year of the spreading, and the council's finding, and the remanding to the quiet house, and then comes to the certifying, where the pale physician must rise and examine the unfit one before the witnesses, and pronounce the marring beyond repair, so that no one may later say the family acted in haste or cruelty. The physician rose. He was a sleek, cold man with the clear water skin of a high house, and he came to my chair and he said, in the flat voice they use for us, "Remove the veil and the gloves and the collar, that the marring may be witnessed and certified." It is the worst moment of the rite. It is meant to be. You are made to strip yourself before the room and stand in the bright light while a clean man catalogues your ruin aloud for the record, the extent of the staining, the percentage of the surface lost, the verdict of beyond repair, and the room watches and you hold your chin level. I had been preparing for it for days. I had built the armor back, plate by plate, the contempt, the held tears, the level chin. I reached up to lift the veil. And Hale said from the back of the room, "No. The Ilthari do not interrupt the severance. It is not done." The word fell into that cold hall like a stone into still water, and every clean head turned, and the speaker's mouth opened, and the physician froze with his hand half out toward me, and into the silence Hale walked from the back of the room to the center of the light where I sat, unhurried, his scarred human hands loose at his sides, and he stopped between me and the physician, and he looked at my mother. "You don't have to do this," he said. His Ilthari was careful and plain, and everyone in the room understood every word. "And she doesn't have to take her clothes off in front of you so a man can count the marks on her. I've examined her. I'm the physician of record in this house. I'll certify what I've found if a certificate is what you need, and what I've found is that there is nothing wrong with her." The pale physician made a small sound, half a laugh. "The marring is extensive. It is plainly visible. You are not Ilthari. You do not know what you are looking at." "No," said Hale. "I'm not, and maybe I don't. I've been looking at it for half a year and I still can't see the thing you all see. I see a woman with patterned skin who can set a bone and read a fever and lift a moss bed onto stone and argue a botanist into the ground. I've examined every part of her your right wants me to count, because that's my work, and I'll tell you what I told her the first week I was here, which is that there is not one thing under that skin that is anything but whole. The marking is on the surface. There is nothing wrong underneath it. I've put my hands on every part of her your council calls ruined, and there is nothing ruined in her. I would stake my license on it. I am staking it now." The hall was very still. My mother looked at him for the first time, truly looked. The high matriarch Oren, whose whole life was the maintenance of the clean surface, looking at a scarred and weathered human who had just told her, in front of the speaker and the council women and the certifying physician and the witnesses, that the doctrine her people had lived by since before the founding of the Pale Compact was simply, factually wrong. And I watched her face, and I saw a thing move across it that I had not seen on my mother's face in many years, which was uncertainty, the small, terrible crack of a person hearing, for the first time, that the floor they have stood on all their life might not be a floor. "You presume," she said, but her voice had lost the certainty that is the whole power of the Pale Houses. "I do," said Hale. "I'm a guest in your country and I don't know your customs and I'm presuming all over them, and I'm sorry for the rudeness of it. But I've spent my life in rooms where bodies are being decided about, and I know the look of a room that's deciding to throw a person away, and I'm not going to stand at the back of it and be a witness to it. Not for this one." And then he turned, not to my mother, but to me, and he crouched down beside my chair the way he had crouched beside old Toller in the dark, so that his weathered face was level with mine, and he said low, only to me but the whole silent room could hear it, "You don't have to lift the veil. You don't have to be certified. You don't have to be dead in anyone's roles. Come down off the chair. We've got a moss bed dying and I can't do the lens work without you. I have turned that moment over 10,000 times in the years since, and I have never been able to decide which part of it broke the armor. I think it was the moss bed. I think it was that even in the center of the worst thing, with the whole weight of the pale compact bearing down, he reached for the plainest, smallest, truest thing between us, the dying moss and the lens work and the we of it, and held it out to me like a hand. The Ilthari, when they recognize a person at last, are given to grand declarations, the hand to the mouth, the public weeping, the falling to the knee. He gave me a dying moss bed and a stool that needed filling, and it was the grandest declaration anyone has ever made me, because it was a future, plainly stated, in which I was a person who was needed for ordinary work among the living. I lifted the veil. I want to be exact about this, because it is the center of everything. I did not lift it for the physician to be certified. I lifted it for myself in the bright daylight of that cold hall with the whole delegation watching, and I took it off, the pearl thread veil, and I set it on the floor the way they had let my hair fall to the marble a year before, except this time it was my own hand doing it and my own choosing. And then I took off the gloves, and I put back the high collar from my throat, and I stood up out of the chair into the full white light of the tall window, marked from wrist to throat and across both shoulders, the bronze-dark veining stark in the daylight, and I let them all look at me, my mother and the speaker and the cold, clean physician and the council women in their pearl. And for the first time since the first line came up, I let them look without holding my chin level out of obedience, but lifted it of my own will, because a human had told me there was nothing wrong underneath, and I had decided, standing in that light, to believe him over the whole of my people. I did not weep. The water rose to the lid of my eye and stood there, the way I had trained it, but this time I let it stand not out of armor but out of something else, something that was almost joy and almost grief and was, I think now, simply the feeling of being seen whole by one person in a room of people who could not see me at all. My mother looked at me for a long moment, and then she stood and she said to the speaker in a voice gone strange and quiet, "We will not proceed with the certifying today." And she gathered the delegation, and they went, the 3 closed carriages down the Care Vale Road in the bright thaw, the severance left unfinished. I never saw her again. I have heard over the years that she ordered the pale physicians to study the marking, the staining, the thing they had thrown away daughters over for 1,000 years, and that they found, when they finally bothered to look underneath, what Hale had found in a single winter, that there was nothing wrong underneath it. I do not know if that is true. I would like it to be true. It would mean the lifting of the veil did more than save one woman, but I have learned not to need it to be true. It was enough that it saved the one. Hale and I did not become, that day, the thing the Ilthari would make of it in a grand declaration. There was no falling to the knee. There was a dying moss bed, and we went out to it in the thaw-cold afternoon, the 2 of us in Brannock, and we lifted the beds onto stone with our bare hands, and my wrists were bare in the daylight and I did not gloves them, then or ever again. We worked until the light went. And at the end of it, in the last gray hour, standing in the frost garden with the dirt of the work on both our hands, he looked at me, the whole of me, the face and the marked throat and the shorn hair grown out now to a rough dark cap, and he did not say any of the things the Ilthari say. He said, "You'll stay, then, up here. The work's better with 2. And I understood it was the only kind of vow he knew how to make, the plain kind, the kind that is a future stated as a fact, and I understood that it was the truest kind there is, and I said, "I'll stay." We stayed. We are old now, the 2 of us, by the count of his world and mine. The relief office never did send anyone to replace him, and after a while it stopped asking him to come down, and Greyhold became, slowly and without anyone deciding it, less a place where the houses send their dead and more a place where the unfit come to be made well by a human and a marked woman who learned medicine in a cold surgery through a long winter. Old Toller sees a little now. Hale could not give him back the eyes the lowland physicians let fail, but he gave him back the light at the edges, and Toller says that is enough to walk the garden by. Sarah ran the kitchens until the end and died among us, touched and unhidden, her bronze-dark hand in mine. The soft-faced twins are grown men with straightened faces, because we set the bones the Lowland doctors would not, and they have gone down the mountain into the world wearing their own skin without shame, which is a thing I did not think I would live to see. I keep in a box in the East Room the pearl thread veil. I do not wear it. I keep it the way you keep a thing you have walked out of, to remember that you walked. And on the bright mornings, when the daylight comes thin and white off the ice fields through the east window, I go out into the frost garden bare-armed with the dirtwork waiting, and Tomas is already there, old now, his scarred hands slower than they were, and he looks up when I come, and he looks at my face first, the way he has looked at my face first every morning for a lifetime, and there is still in his weathered human eyes the thing my tongue has no good word for, the thing about the inside. And I have stopped needing a word for it. They had a word for what I was, Veshtir, beautiful once and then not, a thing gone wrong on the surface to be set apart so the clean lines could close over the place where it had been. He never learned the word. No one ever taught it to him. He came up the mountain knowing only how to look at a person and see, underneath the surface that my whole world had drowned in, the thing that was whole and had always been whole and only needed one pair of eyes in all the worlds to refuse, plainly and stubbornly, and for a lifetime to look away. I was the bride no one would look at, and one human never looked away. That is the whole of it. That is the whole of everything.